Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden.
And I am today's co-splainer, Meghan Cox Gurdon.
Welcome, Meghan. Welcome back. You've co-splained twice.
Yes, I have. And I was in the hot seat as your guest.
You were in the hot seat, or the bar stool, as it is in this studio. You have a full bar. Did you notice in front of you today?
I even have M&Ms. There's everything you could possibly want, except maybe a boiled egg. I think people have those on bars, too.
But yes, no, you're the author, of course, of The Enchanted Hour, The Miraculous Power of Reading Aloud in the Age of Distraction.
Yes, ma'am.
Which was a great book. And if you want to hear Meghan talk more about the book itself, she appeared on episode 2 of this current season 3. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, Christina's in Gainesville, Florida, rallying the troops, stirring up trouble.
And taking a positive angle, I believe. That's her. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Well, trying to take a positive angle about feminism while getting yelled at. Yeah. So she does. And we also have Zoe is away, too. And in the studio, we have Jane Knight, who is a colleague of Zoe's. And she is filling in today in the also co-splaining Zoe role. So welcome to you both. So tell us now, this book came out, a month ago?
No, January 15th.
Oh, January 15th.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
I know, the time is she.
And tell people what it's like to do a book tour. This is your first book.
Yeah.
I remember for years you talked about doing a book. And in fact, funnily, I remember one of the books you were going to do was called Late Bloomers. Do you remember that?
I do. I'm amazed that you remember that. That's right, because I was taking courage from the fact that there are so many people in the world who, I mean, admittedly, their stories are not that common, but they, stumble, as it were, not later in life exactly, but, at some point into their cause. And, I mean, the poster child for that is Grandma Moses, right? She was in her 70s.
That's true. Would explain the name.
Do you know, I had, you probably remember me telling you this at the time, but I had, when I was young, read that Ernest Hemingway was 24 when he wrote his, got his first short story published. And I thought, 24? Oh, my God, I've got years. 24 is so far in the future. And then suddenly, whoa, there's 24 in the rearview mirror.
Way in the
rearview mirror.
I also thought that topic, as you were thinking of it at the time, and I honestly can't remember whether it was 10 years ago or 20. We've known each other a long time. But I remember thinking, spoken like a mother of 5.
Well, I think at the time because I had maybe 3 children, and I would eventually have 5. Yeah. No, I know, it's funny. I've thought to myself a couple of times in the last couple of months when I've been promoting the book, and I've had got to go on TV and things like that. Gee, I wish I'd been able to do this book when I was younger, because you look better on TV. Right? But the fact of the matter is, I had 5 children and a bunch of columns I was writing, and I didn't have time. So, and also I didn't have the experience, and maybe, who knows, the confidence. So it's really fun to have the book out. I love it. I was nervous about submitting it. I mean, all these
it's
steps
like
along
having
the process.
Another child.
Your husband had a wonderful saying about this. He said, it was last fall before the book came out. It was all very exciting. We're sort of choosing things and deciding what we're going to do with it, and choosing covers and things like that. And he said, "Oh, you're in that wonderful phase. You're out of toddlerhood, right? So you're not worried about writing the manuscript or selling it or whatever. And you're in that halcyon phase where you're out of toddlerhood, but you haven't hit adolescence yet, when you have to send your child into the world and see how other people treat it."
Oh, and then you're so lucky if it doesn't become an utter disappointment to you. That's the thing. If the book has 1 month, if you're lucky at the sort of front shelf of a bookstore.
Yeah.
But yours, you have had great success.
No,
with
it's been going really well, and there are lots of speaking engagements, and I've been on the radio a ton, and in television a bit, and and of course I haunt the rankings, right? The Amazon rankings. Yeah. And my publisher in the UK has a website that I could log on to, and they update the numbers every Friday. And man, I'm right on. I look at my watch, I'm like, oh, what time is it in England? Yeah, I'm going to check the numbers. So I'm optimistic.
Well, as the saying goes, you've spent 30 years to become an overnight sensation.
Right.
But what I wanted to take that to, because this is obviously a very exciting time, and I remember when we first met, and we met through journalism.
Yeah.
And we were both, I think we may have talked about this before when you were on, but we were both new mothers. But we felt also like we were kind of pioneers because we were in a time where women weren't having a lot of children, especially at young ages. The culture was to postpone it and put importance into your careers. And so those of us who had had children in the shockingly young, age of 28, which I think is when I had my first child, we both, and this is, I think, how we bonded, we both felt we had to create our own worlds, really, of marriage, and then motherhood, because except for whatever examples we had in our own lives, we had no real idea of how to, the whole life work. I mean, that was very new, and we were very freakish in our situations to both be married and have children in our late 20s.
Yeah.
In other cultures, in times we would have been dead by then, or spinsters and old maids.
Well, I started a little later than you did. My first daughter was born when I had just turned 30. So 29, I was pregnant, and 30, she was born. And I did have a wonderful career before that. And in fact, it continued for quite a long time after she
Right, you were in radio and TV?
Yeah, and I was working overseas as a foreign correspondent. So I was traveling all over the place and going into exciting and interesting and difficult situations. And it was it was a wonderful, wonderful life. But it also didn't really, it didn't coexist with perfect harmony once I had children. And I had an experience, which I think I wrote about for the magazine that you were editing when we first met, I was about 6 months pregnant. I was in Northern Ireland, and there were, bottles being thrown, and it wasn't a riot situation, but it was a very uncomfortable situation. Right. Two sides.
You mean like Molotov cocktails, too?
Yeah, well, no flames, but yeah. I mean, this was before the Good Friday Accords. Things were very tense in Northern Ireland in those days, and
about to be tense again.
Yeah, alas, and a policeman sort of gestured to me. I had my radio equipment and my great big stomach, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I thought, I had the old training to think, who are you, oh patriarchal figure, to tell me, question my choices as a powerful woman? And so I had that first instinct of that. And then I thought, oh my God, he's right. What am I doing here? I have a lovely...
This isn't just a bag of sand I'm dragging around with my stomach.
Also, this isn't about me anymore, right? Yeah. I have a daughter at home who's little and she needs me. I have a husband who needs me. I have this new baby who's coming along. Didn't know who it was then. It turned out to be my son, my one and only, because I have 4 daughters, 1 son. And that was the beginning of my change. But so, as you say, we were finding our way forward in a culture that told us that it was stupid and wrong and a waste to stay home with our children.
Or not even stay home, to even consider that you sort of put them before you, or that they should in any way compromise your dreams and ideals. Yeah. And I'd written a book called, as I always like to plug it, What Our Mothers Didn't Tell Us, again, available on Amazon, that one of the theories of that book, which is interesting now because I want to see if our theories have borne out, was if you want to have children, you should do it sooner rather than later. Because that was also the time we were watching women who were real sort of pioneers in the executive floor postpone everything only to be sort of lonely and trying to get pregnant in their 40s. Yeah. And that was a real sort of ghost of Christmas future potential. So if you didn't want that, what do you do? And so I was a big advocate, and I got a lot of trouble for this at the time, take marriage and motherhood seriously younger. Yeah. Try and lock it down, sort of not to say get the babies out of the way, but do it when you are actually, your body most wants to do it. You have the most energy, and you also have the most flexibility going forward. So if you want that big career, you will go back. You will be able to go back to the workforce. And when you're in your 20s, nobody really, what are you going to be, an intern? Nobody's really trusting you with a lot of things. So, and then some of the examples, I look back through women I'd really admired through history, and they all bloomed after they had children. They went and entered their literary careers. They entered their
Yeah, we've been given
science careers.
Given a false picture for so long.
Ruth Ginsburg, you know.
People, or Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher was an example.
She stayed home with her children until they were 6. They were twins, I believe. They went to school, and boom, she started her career.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We were sold a bill of goods, and so we were kind of groping our way forward, trying to figure out. I mean, it's funny now. It all seems so long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, the conversation has moved so far. But you remind me that idea about the women who, sacrificed so much in order to get to the executive suite or whatever.
Right.
I mean, that sacrifice was
more than
real.
they realized.
More than they realized. And you discovered, I remember when you were researching that book, that their daughters were now at the, you were talking to them, they were in colleges, and that was your audience. And a lot of these daughters thought, I don't want to do that. I don't want to kill myself for a job and wait until really late in life to have a family. Oh,
and then trying to find a husband in your late 30s and
much harder. The Spectator, I remember, had a this must have been, oh my gosh, in the late 80s, so a really long time
British
ago.
Spectator?
British Spectator had a little cartoon, and it was a very busy businesswoman striding along, checking her watch, thinking, I've forgotten something. I forgot to have children.
Oh, no, that's so awful.
You could never print something like that today. In fact, we can't even talk about this. So this is not happening.
We'll have to edit that out.
Yeah, edit this whole thing out. Let's just have white noise.
Okay, but let's now look back. And so we had all these theories, and I'm putting out these theories in a book, really not knowing what the hell I'm doing, because I was still like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I hope it really works out. So look back, other paths you might have taken, regrets. I mean, you've managed to postpone this writing a book idea till your, can we just say?
I can say 50s. Yeah. Oh, no, 50s. Fabulous.
And I think, you are enjoying it. My first book came out when I still had 2 children under 5, and I wanted to blow my brains out.
Yeah.
Like trying to do book promotion and speeches. And you're on the phone and you've shut the door and you're on the
writing
radio.
Notes underneath the door saying, Mom, come on.
Go to your father. You're the father going, no, she's like, Mommy, I want that. And that goes across the radio airwaves, But now at this stage, the kids actually are helpful. They help you with your Instagram.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, no, it worked out. Look, you and I both have been unbelievably blessed to have husbands who are supportive of our careers, supportive of our, the time that we've wanted to spend at home with our kids, and supportive in the sense that they both brought in an income. Right. It has really worked out, I have to say. But I'm very aware that, but for an accident of fate, if I'd married a philanderer or a gambler, this, the enchanted hour might have taken me another 50 years.
The disenchanted hour, it would be called. No, that's absolutely right. But I think there's also this sense of, I still get, that book still continues to sell. I get tiny little royalty checks once a year. It was written pre-internet, but I think the broader messages of taking marriage seriously, taking your personal path that you want as seriously as your career path still resonates. And part of, I think, the reason, yes, of course you feel blessed. And, finding the right person in the end, it's like gambling. It's a crapshoot.
Right, for sure.
But you also have to be open to it.
Yeah.
And if you're saying to yourself, I'm not even going to think about marriage till my mid-30s, or I don't believe there's a guy out there for me, or it's all patriarchal, and,
it's a recipe for such unhappiness.
Or I'm going to go into relationships and draw up contracts of, you do this and I do that, and you do this and I do that, and don't step on my independence.
Can I remind you of an episode from your own book, which I now remember? It's, I think it ends one of the chapters, and you and David, your husband, were playing tennis with another couple. You didn't know them.
Oh, no, this is when we went to weekly tennis clinic, just to get out of the house, really, and do something at a court down the street.
And the two of you got to your side of the court, and then David realized that he had left his racket on the other side, or maybe at the entrance, and you said, "Oh, I'll go get it." And the woman on the other side, your corollary in the other marriage, said something like, "Oh, I was hoping you'd make him get it himself."
Yeah. She wasn't actually married. It was a group of
that's not
6
surprising.
people. And no, we'd all left our rackets because we were doing these exercises. And I just said, I was nipping over and, I'll grab it. Yeah. I bet you would do the same for me. And that's a whole conversation. But I tell my 2 daughters, I think you give yours. Well, you just had one get married. Beautiful Molly got married.
Yeah.
She's 24.
Yeah. No, she's taken. I mean, I didn't tell her to. I mean, it's up.
No, but
she wants to get on with the business of life, and she's found her husband, and he's found her. Right.
It's not same for men. It's getting that question settled. Maybe if they settle a little later, but it's the biggest factor of life. And when it's settled, and your whole world opens up because now you don't have to think about that.
But also that almost makes it seem like, I don't know. There is this idea that a home is the biggest purchase you will ever make. Mm-hmm. That is incorrect. The biggest purchase you will ever make is the opportunity cost, let us say, the purchase of the husband or wife that you take, right? Mm-hmm. That partnership is absolutely central for everything else. And then you buy the house or whatever. Mm-hmm. But for the most consequential decision is that one.
Right.
And the
for
idea
both
that,
sexes.
Right.
Both sexes.
But the idea that is being, no, for sure. I mean, as you say, it opens up everything. Then you can just get on as a team and go ahead and enjoy, bite off the big bite of the cheese of life. I don't know what the metaphor is. It's probably cheese. Not a good metaphor for life, really. Life is a cheese.
Life is a big cheese. But this was to go back. But I think what you had conveyed to your daughter, Molly, and what I hope I'm conveying to my daughters, is you not only take this prospect seriously, you take dating seriously, and you take yourself seriously. Like this, you respect yourself. You don't waste time with people who don't treat you nicely. You are shopping. Like you're not sort of falling into
dating
quasi relationships,
finding a mate,
right?
A life partner, right? It's not. I mean, that is
not
properly
about
understood.
Hanging out together to
kind of vaguely
go to the dog park together.
I mean, that's all those things are lovely, but if when it's I mean, I have to be honest. I didn't think, okay, fine, I'm setting my cap for some filler. There was no strategy.
You didn't even have a cap, Meghan.
I did not have a cap, but there was no strategy. And again,
that sounds more calculating than it is.
Oh, certainly in my case, I stumbled into a lot of very wise bourgeois decisions that my background and childhood did not set me up to encounter. I grew up with hippies, and my poor mom. Mom, you were not a hippie, but you were hippie adjacent. No, I bought the Betty Friedan Kool-Aid. I bought a big bottle of it, and I drank it. And I drank the Ms. Magazine Kool-Aid. And I was in college. I was for the first 3 years or 2 years. Well, I don't know what they were, but anyway, I was I was a women's history major. And in senior year, I woke up. I mean, I was very attracted by the certainty of that worldview. Mm-hmm. Because I had not grown up, when you're hippie adjacent, there isn't a lot of certainty. It's all kind of free. And I woke up one morning my senior year of college and thought, I don't believe any of this stuff. And I bailed out of my program, and I didn't end up with a concentration in anything like women's history. It was just I just didn't buy the grievance culture of it anymore.
Right. To go back and to be fair to that time, and especially the Betty Friedans, who now seems almost conservative because she remained very pro-marriage, very pro having children, even if she had a bad marriage. But they came out of legitimate concerns. Women continue to have
for sure
legitimate concerns.
For sure.
And each generation of women is going to struggle with its own, eternal problem, barricades to overcome or whatever. But I think we saw then, it was already happening then, it's especially happening now, this grievance culture, this anger, this othering of men.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
And how are you going to get along? Right. And have a marriage, or let alone even a relationship, if you're constantly trying to operate like an enclosed island or species that will only have the most reluctant contact and as you say, it's not generous, it's not giving, it's not being open. This also kind of brings us to our guest, her name is Michele Gelfand, and she is a cultural psychologist, which we can unpack that. That's like the best job in the world.
Greatest job.
And she's the author of a recent book called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers: How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. She's also, by the way, I thought this was interesting, past president of the International Association for Conflict Management, which sounds like marriage counseling for nation states like Iran, Iraq. We need you to sit in the room.
Now use I statements. I feel that your missiles are targeting my people.
How did you feel when the Ayatollah said that about you? But anyway, she spent 20 years, 50 countries researching this book. And it's very relevant to the discussion we are having about forming cultures of marriage and motherhood in this modern what did you call it? Age of distraction and dystopia. She spent 2 decades in 50 countries researching her book. She didn't just study national cultures. She studied all age groups, family variations, social classes, businesses, states, and she has identified a primal pattern that can trigger cooperation or conflict. So what you might apply to Iran and Iraq, or, Brexit, to relations between the EU and Britain or the US, we can also do with each other. And the distinction she makes, and we'll get her to explain it, is you can pretty much divide everybody in the world into something that she calls tight or loose. Tight cultures or loose cultures. I remember you and I both love George Eliot and Middlemarch, and there was a very cranky character called Cosmo, an old man who was spent years and years and years trying to develop the key to all mythologies, the answer to everything. Yes. But I think Michele, without being a cranky old man, has actually come up.
The key to all mythology.
Or the key to everything. And this book truly, and it's
the universal remote.
It's the universal remote. It is so well written. It is so charming. It is so...
Yeah, it's a terrific book.
It's so easy to read, but it is transformative. It's like a self-help book for the world. And you come away from it, and it really... You start looking at everything differently. I think you'll start looking at yourself differently. So let's bring on Michele, and we'll talk about this.
Fantastic.
So welcome, Michele, to the Femsplainers.
Great to be here.
Well, as you know, the most important thing is that we have you settled with your cocktail. You're in studio. So you had requested either a Cosmo, which we're not going to say that's a throwback to Sex and the City because you have written an international book. So it is a cosmopolitan book. Mm-hmm. So the Cosmo is totally suitable. Mm-hmm. And you also suggested you like dry German Rieslings, and you didn't trust us, so you brought in your own dry German Riesling. So we have just like a spilling over bar today.
Just want to back up, just in case.
Yeah. I'm sorry Christina isn't here because she would be so happy.
Be enchanted.
She'd be all that. But anyway, there's obviously, because your theory applies to everything, we could talk about everything, but we want to keep it focused somewhat. So could you just give us an overview, the big, broad overview of tight versus loose?
So, I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, which means that somehow I got people to agree to pay me to study world's cultures for the last 25 years or so. And I've been interested in how do we understand the tremendous diversity that we see around us. We have above 195 countries, 7,000 languages, many, many thousands of religions. Is there anything that we can kind of understand that helps us to really, from a parsimonious point of view, understand that diversity? And a lot of times we focus on very superficial aspects of culture, like red versus blue or east versus west, rich versus poor. And I wanted to know, is there something deeper, a deeper cultural code that drives a lot of our differences? And can this code explain behavior in pre-industrial ancient societies, in modern nations, and modern states, and even in our own households? And that's really what the book Rule Makers, Rule Breakers is about. And in essence, over the last 20 years, when I've been studying human cultures, I've noticed this really interesting distinction, which I call tight and loose. And it has to do with the strength of cultural rules. And the idea is that all cultures have rules. We need rules. We don't even realize how much we need rules. I mean, imagine if I came in here wearing a bikini, or, we walk outside and people are driving on the right side or the left side of the road, or people are, having sex, on the benches outside of AEI, rather than in private settings. We're a normative species. We make rules so that we can avoid these scenarios. And it's the glue that keeps us together. Social norms. But what I've discovered is that some groups have very strict social norms. We call them tight cultures. And others have very loose norms. They're much more permissive. And I've been trying to understand, why do these differences evolve and what consequence, and how can we use them in our everyday life to manage our relationships with our coworkers, our colleagues, our kids. And that's the kind of big picture gist.
It's fantastic. I mean, you can see it. I feel you can see it. You give an example early on of, I actually was the person in this scenario of the lights in Berlin, changing at 11 o'clock at night, and everyone just patiently waits. There are no cars on the road, and everybody waits for the lights to change so that they can cross the road. That is to say, pedestrians. I was that person in Dusseldorf years ago. I came out of the train station.
You are that person.
I was the ugly
in Washington,
American.
D.C.
I came out of the train station.
She's a tight person.
Well, I don't know where. I think I'm all over the place.
We'll assess you later.
Yeah, okay. But, I came out of the train station and I thought, okay, well, there's no cars coming, and people had assembled on both sides of the road. I just started surging across the road, and I got a lot of looks. It was my first experience, I think, A, being the ugly American. I've become much nicer since then. But B, encountering the tightness of a culture I hadn't seen before.
Yeah, actually in Germany, there's a new device in some cities called street pong, where on the street corners you can play ping pong with the person across the street from you. It's an electronic game, and you can see when the light's going to change, and it tells you exactly how much time you have to play this game. And it's an extra incentive to stay put and to be coordinated.
Is it a training mechanism for new arrivals?
It could be for Americans that violate the rules like me, but it's actually just a device to sort of think about, how do we incentivize people staying at the corner when we know that there's a kind of incentive also to kind of dart across, which is really a problem in Germany when there's a lot of people. And
but as you point out, they'll do it on an empty street corner at midnight. And then you compared it. Actually, you had, why is all the clocks in Germany on time, and why in Brazil they aren't? So give a little quick, like Singapore versus the loose women of New Zealand. You had these wonderful sort of like quick tour around the world of examples of sort of the two extremes, and then other nations form gradations.
Yeah, so that's right. And what I set out to do, this is about 30 nations, about 7,000 people, to try to see if we could put these countries on a metric of tight and loose. You think about personality. We all know that there's extroverts, there's introverts, there's people that are more or less neurotic. We wanted to see, is there a metric that we can place countries on in terms of the strictness of the norms, tight and loose? So we developed measures, and we collected a lot of research data. We published this paper in Science some years ago, and we were able to place nations on a metric. So Singapore and Japan, Germany, Austria veered tight. Brazil, New Zealand, Netherlands, and the U.S. in general veered looser, although I can talk later about, we can zoom in and see a lot of variation in the U.S. And, it's interesting because what we discovered in this study was that there's a reason why these countries evolved to be tight and loose. The countries didn't share any common geography or any common language or tradition, but they shared something really important, which was the amount of threat that they have. Mm-hmm. And so as I was collecting this data, this study took about 10 years to do. I got a lot of gray hair from it, which you can see. And I
don't see any gray hair, just for the record.
And as I was collecting the data across these 30 nations, I was also collecting data on how many times, for example, has a country been invaded over the last 100 years, or potentially invaded, or how many natural disasters have there been in this country? How many people per square mile are there? And not just now, but even as long ago as in 1500. And what I was betting my money on, actually NSF's money, was that there's going to be a connection between the amount of threat that a nation has and the amount of rules they have. And the idea is pretty simple, that when you have a lot of threat, it's collective threat, you need rules to coordinate people to survive. And you can't solve these problems on your own. So you need to coordinate and cooperate, and rules help you do that. And in contexts that have less threat, like in New Zealand, every country has some threat. We have our own threats we can talk about. But that has comparatively less threat. You can afford to be more permissive. And this rule, the threat, the tightness connection, tends to be something we see in nations, within organizations, within households. So it's not the only factor that predicts tightness, but it's one really important one.
So what comes to mind, of course, is New Zealand and Japan, two kind of island nations, right? Both, it's sort of in similar bodies of water, as it were. One subject to natural disasters, not invasion, but natural disasters at a huge rate, and the other subject to neither.
Yeah.
And no natural disasters, no invasion.
Yeah, and sometimes, what we can see is that, as a general principle, when countries experience a threat, they do tend to tighten up. I can see that.
What happened in 9/11, if you remember, in the United States?
That's right.
There was an incredible spirit of rallying together, which I had not experienced. I mean, I'm an immigrant from Canada. Yeah. Semi-tight. But I remember that feeling that the whole nation was one, and I'd never experienced that.
And it's really evolutionarily adaptive. So we've coded ethnographies of societies that have existed many hundreds of years ago, and we can see the same exact principle, that the countries that were tight then also had a lot of threat. And so it's something that is really just part of our DNA, in a sense, that when we have a threat, whether it's the Boston bombing or it's 9/11 or it's in New Zealand has their own share of temporary threats, we tend to tighten up. But unless those threats are really chronic, then we can kind of go back to our old sense of permissiveness. I will mention that, what's interesting is that we sometimes see that the same, even fake threat or exaggerated threat, can also tighten people up. I can see this in my own laboratory, if I bring people in and tell them about a terrorist attack or about a natural disaster or other threats, that you could see people really quickly desire to have stronger rules. And so it's something that is very, like you mentioned in 9/11, is something part of our, part of being human, in a sense, of what has made us this great species to deal with threat.
Right, but you go back even further, that you note that these tight, loose structures are kind of embedded in our brain. They differ across cultures. Like, there's a reason Germans are tight today, and you can go back to their settlers. You can go back to the original settlers. You can go back to Sparta and Athens and see the cultures evolve from there. So it's almost like it's not just even reacting to a history of threats. It goes back way beyond that.
Yeah, it's not just something that's modern day that we invented. It's something that's distinctly human. Norms are human, and whether they're tight or loose is something that groups have calibrated to fit their environment. What's really interesting, in the book I talk about the tight-loose trade-off, because these differences allow groups to have certain assets but certain liabilities.
Yeah, talk about that. Yeah.
And I call it the tight-loose because people always ask me what's better, tight or loose, and it's like, really, it depends on your vantage point. So tight cultures tend to have a lot of order, and loose cultures have much less order. They're much more disorganized. But on the flip side, loose cultures are much more open and adaptive. And, it's interesting. We can see this in crime rates. For example, in Japan, it's one of the lowest crime rates on the planet. And there was a great Wait, Don't Tell Me show where Segal was saying, what do Japanese police officers need more of?
This is the NPR show. I love that show.
Guessing, is it more vacation time, more pay? It turns out that they need more crime, because crime is so low that apparently in some areas in Japan they're trying to egg people on, to commit more crime. So there's a lot more order and monitoring. The eyes are upon you, whether it's a security camera or God. People behave themselves more. And also along this lines of order, tight cultures also have more uniformity. Back to the clock example, I actually looked at how synchronized are clocks around city streets. Do they say the same time? They're uniform. And in tight cultures, they're really like apart by milliseconds. But in loose cultures like Greece and Brazil, you're not totally sure what time it is because things are much less synchronized. Actually, stock prices are more synchronized also in tight cultures. There's a great paper that came out in a journal of financial economics that showed that even the synchrony, not just in terms of what we wear and our clocks show, is found in the stock market because it provides order. And also,
is that a function of technology? I mean, do you have like faster cables in some societies?
No, it's mainly just about people wanting to be in sync. So tight cultures that have a lot of threat, synchrony is really helpful in those contexts. So you have people having more buying and selling coupling of stock behavior in tighter cultures, according to this research in Journal of Financial Economics. And also another benefit of tight cultures, they have more self-control. They have less debt. They have less obesity. I write in the book that even like pets in loose cultures are fatter than in tight cultures.
Yes, true.
In fact, my dog is obese. My German colleague and I are always joking about doing a study of culture in dogs because his dog, he's from Germany, is very well behaved and very skinny. I mean, I'm generalizing, but
probably wears those little architectural glasses and
I mean, really, it's a New Yorker cartoon. My dog
barks about higher ideas.
Yeah. So, loose cultures struggle with these issues. They're much more disorganized, less in sync, and they have a lot of self-regulation failures. But the flip side is that they're much more open and they're much more tolerant and they're much more adaptable. So
creative.
And creative.
Yeah.
And I'll just give you one example. I did this crazy experiment where I bought some warts. You can buy fake warts on the internet. And I had my students go back to all their countries, 20 countries, with these ridiculous warts on their face.
I want this.
You did this with tattoos too, right?
Also.
Fake temporary tattoos. Yeah.
And, it was interesting to see we standardized them to go and ask for directions on city streets or help in city stores and timed how long it took them to get help and the quality of help they got. And it was in the loose cultures where people that looked really different got a lot of help. In the tighter cultures, people who are stigmatized, who are different, struggle because they're different and they're seen as dangerous. So this kind of creativity, openness trade-off is something we see in so many different places, whether it's nations or states or organizations.
Like companies like the old IBM versus like Google, where there are ping pong tables and, people wear whatever. And Israel was the extreme where people, there's not even hierarchies.
Yeah,
and they
there's
just
dogs walking around. I wrote about it in the book. And what's fascinating is when you try to have these companies merge, because tight organizations tend to exist in contexts where there's a lot of coordination in these like airlines or nuclear power plants or manufacturing. And loose cultures evolve in organizations, much more discretion, flexibility, contexts where you have less of that. But they find themselves very attracted to each other, but we found they really have a lot of conflict when they try to merge. So this same tight, loose lens can be applied to organizations.
And also presumably with countries where you get immigration at high or low levels or from different societies, right? That's hard to incorporate in some places.
Yeah, that's right, because it's seen as really very threatening. And we have to appreciate that, they're important to recognize that we all tend to view other cultures from our own point of view. We're kind of ethnocentric about the world that we see. Herodotus, the famous historian, said this, all humans are ethnocentric. And when we can start thinking about why cultural differences evolve for the way they do, we can be less judgmental. And one example is about Singaporeans not being allowed to import a lot of gum into the country and chew gum for non-medicinal reasons. And Americans tend to think that's ridiculous, preposterous. Why can't you chew gum in Singapore? And, when you step back and think, okay, there's so many mouths per capita in Singapore, like 20,000 people per square mile, compared to, 50 people in New Zealand per square mile and more sheep per capita than people. What happened was Lee Kuan Yew, who was the prime minister, said, guys, like, there is gum all over the place. It's a total mess. It's like, it's blocking sensors and it's causing a catastrophe. And what he said was, in a very top-down way, we're just going to ban the tasty treat. It's the easiest thing to do. I don't think people were happy at first, but people understood that we have to sacrifice that kind of freedom for security or order in contexts where there's just so many people per square mile. And if we were accidentally born there, this is what I write about in the book, to have this kind of cultural empathy, we might also embrace that.
Yeah, like, no more gum on my shoe. Okay, let's zoom in, as you said, because one of the most, the $1 billion question, what we all have right now is, why are, as a country, and not just the United States, but other places, why are we so divided? It seems unprecedented. I'm sure it's not in history, obviously. You read about the ancient societies and classes, but let's, here we are. We're all worried. We're watching a big disruption across the globe in Western societies because we just seem not to be able to understand or talk to each other. The people who, as you say, who feel under threat, versus the people who don't. So you both broke down red and blue states under the tight loose category, and then you also did really fascinating research on Trump voters, which also took it out of the cartoon that people might hold. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this red versus blue state has just we got to get rid of this distinction.
Oh, that's
it's
a great
so
idea.
superficial.
Yeah.
We have a new map of the 50 states that vary on tight and loose. And so we have a measure where we can situate states. And what's interesting, when you look at that map, a lot of the southern states tend to veer tight. Some states in the Midwest, some of the coasts tend to be much looser. And one big predictor of that variation has to do with things like natural disasters. But back to your question,
right.
I think that a lot of what we see nowadays is really a tight-loose divide all around the world. And people who are feeling the threat of globalization, the threat of disruption, wanting that traditional order, and wanting the kinds of leaders that can provide that. It's a very rational type of choice. Mm-hmm. It's not that these voters are stupid or racist or, that you have to think about what's driving that motivation. And in our research, we asked people before the Trump election how threatened they feel by various different events. And it was the people that felt very threatened that felt the society was too loose. It was too unorganized. That actually predicted their vote.
Can I interrupt? What were the events that you were asking people to respond to?
A lot of it had to do with what we'd call human-made types of threats, like ISIS and immigration and North Korea. And but also in our data, in other parts of the book, I talk about the working class. And the working class in our data are also very tight as compared to the upper class. And for
can
good
you
reason.
just digress slightly there?
Sure.
Because that I found, you said, and I can summarize for you, you wrote that the working class value conformity, obedience, intolerance for backtalk. I like that. And
yes.
and that upper class parents or even middle, like other class parents, want to encourage self-direction, to be independent, creativity. They're more likely to break rules, be less polite. But they are also, like in the state level, more creative and innovative and more open to differences. And you had a wonderful way of understanding that, well, why would the working class be more tight? Because they are one illness, one accident away from total disaster. Yeah. They are under much more
That's right.
Threat.
That's right.
As it were, then.
That's right. And, we often think about working class, upper class in terms of our bank accounts, but they're really deep-seated cultural codes that are driving those differences. And we've measured, again, how threatened people feel. And that explains differences in desired tightness among the working class and the upper class, among actual tightness in households, because when you're worried about falling into hard living, you need rules to coordinate. They're really helpful. And actually, we asked the working class in our samples to just tell us, what do you think about rules or breaking the rules or following the rules? It's very simple questions. And we coded their responses compared to upper class. And it was the working class that found rules to be very positive. Mm-hmm. You look in a bookstore, you see, break the rules. The rules are terrible.
Yeah,
that's a very
be
upper class.
yourself.
Yeah. And, if you think about it, if you work in occupations that are dangerous, like manufacturing, or you live in neighborhoods that are dangerous, rules are really helpful. And in one study that we did on this, we actually brought 3-year-olds into the laboratory. There's a picture of this in the book with my collaborator, Jesse Harrington, where we wanted to see how do 3-year-old working class kids and upper class kids react to norm violations. And we can't exactly ask them
I love
yes.
these. I love these.
This is the crazy stuff that we do.
Go on. Go on. Explain the differences.
So we brought these kids in and we used this technique where we couldn't ask them about norm violations, but we could have them interacting with a puppet. And they were playing all these great games with Max the Puppet, new games, we made up games called Daxing, where they just learn the rules. And all of a sudden, Max, this great puppet, starts violating the rules.
Right.
And starts announcing that
Max goes wild.
Yeah, Max, the badass puppet. He basically starts to violate the rules and starts announcing that he's actually still following the rules. And we simply video coded the kids and then looked at independent ratings of how did the kids react. And it was the working class kids that got really upset. Upper class kids more likely to laugh, much more kind of flexible around these norm values. So these things arise very early. And that, like you mentioned, they're really functional. And I think in the U.S., it's really important to understand that the working class is really experiencing a lot of disruption and threat.
Right.
And in other countries, like in Germany, I write about this in the book, there's more of a safety net for the working class. There's standardization of certificates. There's sort of a sense that, vocational life and education is something valued. And in the U.S., which is rather loose in general, we really have this idea that people will just come up from the bootstraps and will just, kind of figure out what to do. And it's something that is really causing a lot of this conflict between different people around the states.
So can I just
Yeah,
jump
of course,
in here?
of
Because
course.
we were talking before you arrived, Michelle, about marriage. And one of the things that we've seen, I know, in working class communities, marriage is now decreasing, right?
Yeah.
And upper class people are getting married, staying married, and accruing all the sort of bourgeois benefits that come with it. I don't know if that figured into your research at all, but whether that would, like the disappearance of marriage, which is such a stabilizing.
And religion,
that must add distress, right?
Well, I think what's important to think about is that we're talking about a continuum of like ultra poverty. Like the working class samples that we're looking at are people that are trying to avoid those settings. They're trying to avoid hard living, avoid poverty, avoid the context that you're talking about where things are totally disintegrating. Sociologist Durkheim called this anomie, just like total chaos. And the ultra poor experiences that. Their looseness is really, really high. It's an extraordinarily loose context. So working class are kind of bordering on trying to avoid that. And that's where rules really are helpful. So it's something that we think is, clearly that the working poor and the poor are pretty loose, unlike the working class.
But not happily loose, not loose like New Zealanders.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, one thing that I talk about in the book is this kind of Goldilocks principle of tight loose.
Oh yeah, but don't get to that yet.
Okay, I'm not going to get there yet.
Because I don't want to get to that yet because I want to take us through the sort of landscape of this. So just to go back to the Trump voters. So people were kind of baffled that you had, or certain groups had this idea that the people who voted for Trump were like haters or prejudiced or, working class poor, threatened. And then a whole raft of wealthy suburban women voted for him. And what you're saying is about people having different perceptions of threat. Mm-hmm. And when you look at it that way, that is a much more explanatory view. But then you also you have to talk about the car study you did. That basically, and you said, like, if we understand that the Trump voters who are different from us, they were voting out of these things, we can grow more empathy. But then, on the other hand, the loose people, and let's say the loose people who didn't vote for Trump, who don't have a perception of threat, also you were basically saying that while they are creative and while they contribute and have, they're also entitled assholes. And this came out.
They're norm violators.
Well, okay, this came out in the cars. So I was thinking about, okay, I can see how one can be more empathetic toward the person who feels under threat and economically, at risk. But how do you have empathy for the entitled assholes? The norm violators.
I think empathy it goes both ways.
Well,
and actually,
the
study that you're referring to is actually done by some colleagues at University of California, Berkeley, where they looked at hidden bushes on city streets. This is the kind of crazy stuff we do and they basically looked at which kind of cars cut off other cars.
That's amazing.
Cut off pedestrians.
Yeah.
And it was this kind of upper class cars that tended to do that much more than plumber type vans. And even
they just blew through. The rules were for little people.
If you were in a Mercedes, you just F you, I'm cutting you off.
That's where the beauty of, I think, the trade-off is to appreciate what each culture brings to the table. And for example, in our data, the working class tends to be much more ethnocentric. So they tend to really distrust people from the outside and have much less tolerance for people. They're much less creative when we give them tasks in the laboratory. They are much more norm-abiding, which is a really big strength. But on the flip side, when you look at the people cutting off people in the cars, the upper and middle class, they also tend to be way more tolerant and way more adaptable. And so I think we need both in this country.
Well, you said loose states are better for women. They're better if you're handicapped. They're better if you have mental health issues.
That's right.
So it kind of falls along.
Yeah. Another really fun example that I have is that, tight states tend to be much more polite. Yeah. I mean, my state of New York, where I grew up, is number one in rudeness. I mean, I flip people off all the time. I'm flipping you guys off right now.
Well, and then you got in trouble at the South.
I did.
Yes.
And my husband did too. But, on the other hand, our data show that loose states are much more fun. The tight states tend to be much more boring, as it turns out. I mean, it's kind of in this case, you see much more options for creativity and for recreation and so forth. So there's a lot of trade-offs, and both of them are really needed. It's really when we get to the extremes that we have problems, more than anything.
I know, and I can tell you where you see the extremes. And I wonder if people can actually flip from tight to loose depending on proximity to whatever. Because if you're driving in a car down MacArthur Boulevard in Washington, D.C., and you see a bicyclist on the side of the road, you begin to fume and swear and kind of, steam comes out of your ears because those jerks are in the road.
Only if they're like...
They're encroaching.
They're always
Oh, because
jerks.
there are bike lanes at MacArthur, and they
will not use the bike lanes.
They don't use those.
When you're in a car, you hate the bikers so much, and you just hate them and hate them. And when you're a biker, you switch instantly, and you think, who are these jerks in the cars? Why are they,
Right.
So, I think that's just maybe a very personal, maybe it's just me, but I think that people can maybe flop from one to the other.
Absolutely. In fact, we constantly are navigating tight, loose in our daily lives. Like, when you go to, a job interview or to a funeral or to a library, we immediately tighten up. We have more self-control. We're more high on our normative radar. But when we're at a party or out in a park or in a place where there's much looser norms, we're able to kind of loosen up and have less self-regulation. So we all are constantly calibrated. But the important thing is that some of us have our own default in terms of how much we are norm-abiding versus norm-violating.
Well, this is, I think, what is so important about, your theory and also your book is you approach this whole topic without politics. Like you didn't go...
So refreshing.
You didn't go into it saying,
you.
Well, the white males are this and you just... And you found, and this is what is interesting, you found that these looser states like California, looser people, you know what? They tend to be more accepting of different types of people. You wrote that it was helpful in understanding gender and race. And you wrote that groups that have greater power, those that control important resources, have far more latitude to deviate from rules. In many societies, whites, males, and heterosexuals, regardless of class, tend to have greater power. They have looser worlds. By contrast, women, minorities, and homosexuals have less power and less latitude and are subject to stronger punishment, even for the same norms. But you came to that not as some predetermined ideologue, but just from the observations of your research.
Yeah,
which
I mean, I think
interesting.
I appreciate that because I really tried to be balanced about it. And even when you try to be balanced, people can try to read into, she likes looseness. Oh, no, wait, she likes tightness. And then you kind of say, no, maybe that's not the case. I do think one of the only ideological point I have in the book is that we should really take culture more seriously, that it's this omnipresent.
Not ideological.
This is more like
everything.
Me being kind of quasi-religious about culture in the sense that, even I talk in the book about when contexts get extremely loose, this invites tightness, and we should be anticipating that. Like with ISIS, we collected data that showed that, a lot of places when ISIS first arrived really supported ISIS because they were providing necessary order in a context that was totally loose and was really unpredictable and chaotic. And I think a lot of times in foreign policy, we miss the boat on the cultural part of the equation because culture's it's a weird puzzle. It's invisible, but it's omnipresent.
Yeah.
So it's affecting us all the time. It's like the fish in the water example where, two fish are swimming and one fish swims by them and says, "How's the water, boys?" And they swim on and say, "What the hell is water?"
Right.
And it just shows that our important realities are things we can't see often. And culture is one of those. I got interested in this field because I remember in the early 90s, watching Baker and Aziz negotiate. And a lot of the cross-cultural psychologists were kind of chatting about how, they're...
Hang on, can you explain that Aziz was not the comedian?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean...
You said Baker and Aziz. Can you
context where they were negotiating over, the future of Iraq and Kuwait. And, there's so many cultural differences. It's not the only factor that predicts diplomacy, but as someone who studies negotiation and culture, it's really alarming to me when we ignore culture, whether it's about ISIS or when we're trying to understand Duterte. Why is he so popular? There's a really obvious reason, which is that he, again, is
bringing
providing
order
to chaos.
Yeah.
And it's something that we should be anticipating
right.
and be part of our foreign policy as we're thinking through, how to approach different nations and their histories and their cultures, why they evolved the way they did.
Well, what about at home? Do you see sort of like flashing lights that we should be paying attention to?
Well, right. And I was into that thing that then what about biology being destiny? Because do you allow for the hard wiring of the sexes? Right? Like others will argue that culture is everything. Women are only, conditioned into being this way. Men are only conditioned to being that way.
Yeah, I think it's clearly, many people would argue it's both, that nature and nurture are really both important. And I think we're just starting to try to tease out how these things interact. How do genes and culture interact? It's such a phenomenally interesting question around, for example, we have some research that shows that people have certain genes, certain alleles that are subject to vigilance tend to be found more in tight cultures. Mm-hmm. So there's a strong connection between certain genes and culture. And the question is, over the course
of history, does the culture turn the gene on, or did the gene turn the culture on?
And do certain individuals get selected? Do they actually do better in those cultures because of certain genes? That's kind of an evolutionary type of story. But this data is really preliminary. We published it, and other people have been starting to publish work on genes and culture. And, hopefully in 25 years, we'll have way more research on this. But it's fascinating, and I think both are clearly very important.
Well, to go back to your point that, news you can use from your tight versus... So let's apply this. Okay, now we're going to call you, Dr. Gelfand. I'm having trouble with my husband. He just lets our kids do anything. And I think they should be doing their homework and going to bed. Okay. Talk about this in the context of our daily lives.
I have to say that parenting is one of my favorite topics now to think about related to tight loose, because it's a context where we really don't anticipate differences with our spouse in terms of how much we want to regulate behavior and be strict versus maybe have more latitude. It causes so much conflict. And in my household, for example, the way that we deal with this is we kind of think about all the domains that we need to have rules in, whether it's, health, or how you treat your sister, or work, or how sloppy you are around the house, what a mess you are. We sit down and say, okay, let's negotiate this. My husband definitely leans tighter than me, and I'm moderately even more loose, for sure. And what's really exciting is to think about, okay, why is he tight? Let's think about and empathize with the reasons why he might be different than me. But then let's think about, what's your priority? Negotiation's always about priorities, around, let me see if you can get your high priority and I'll get my high priority. And my lowest priority is how messy they are around the house. I could care less. I don't need to have rules.
You put your wet towel on the bed.
I do.
Oh my God. That is.
I get a lot of.
Yeah, well, I know someone who shall go nameless in our family who does that, and it drives me nuts.
Yeah. So, what's interesting in our point of view, we sort of decided, okay, these are the domains that we want to be tight in. After a lot of discussion, here's the domains we want to be loose in. We use the terminology with the kids. The kids know this terminology, and we can talk about it. And it helps to kind of give a little bit more of a parsimonious way to think about something and have less conflict.
Right, because it's not moral. It's not judgmental. I think that was the other takeaway from this. And as you can say, whether it's looking at the people who vote differently from you or your spouse, it's about saying, okay, I understand. You're more this way than that way. And it's not better or worse, because, as you point out, both sides need each other. You need the creativity and the acceptance of the looseness.
And each has
need
its
the rules of the yin-yang.
That's right. And often you're surprised.
It's a negotiation.
It's a negotiation, and those are places that you can come up with really creative agreements, like we did in our household. But also, I think
What did you do? What was that creative agreement?
Well, it was okay, you need to be tight in terms of your health, but when it comes, and how you treat each other and your schoolwork, but you can go to bed whenever you want. You can have no curfew. We're just going to trust you do what you need to do. You could be a mess.
This is what I do with our third child.
Yeah.
Yeah,
really works out. Not so, it didn't work. It wasn't that loose with the first two, but yes.
But, it's interesting. I think the negotiation lens also is something organizations can do also. I read in the book about how organizations like United, they've arguably getting too tight, and they needed to insert some flexibility, what I call flexible
for sure.
tightness.
When you're dragging customers off plane,
that's
a bad. Somebody needs.
You are in the wrong seat, and we're going to drag you down the corridor.
Bodily drag you.
Yeah, and this is probably not a good idea. And people are just following the rules without thinking about it. And I talk about how even these systems, they need to be tight. We don't want people in United Airlines making all sorts of weird decisions, right? But we can.
Or following the book to where it makes no common sense.
Absolutely no sense. I interviewed people who said it's just blind following the blind. And but even these systems, United is now trying to insert some discretion into non-safety domains. And on the flip side, you have places like Tesla, or Uber, who needed to veer loose, very creative places, but arguably getting way too loose. And I call this the need for structured looseness. Find some domains to have more oversight, more accountability. So even at sort of other levels besides just households, you can sort of start negotiating this. And I think it's something that is eminently possible. And we have some examples in the book about it, of how organizations are trying to do this. So it's really exciting to think about it as negotiable and to live with people who are different, understand them better, label it as tight loose.
There's so much more respect in the world that you describe, actually, because you really kind of respect them. Like,
right, it's a broader label. It's not saying like you're black, you're white, you're whatever. You're not confined to a narrow label. It's like you're tight or you're loose.
Right.
Okay. Goldilocks principle. Okay, go.
Well, I think what we discovered, because a lot of times people are saying, well, is certain cultures, are they more wealthy or are they more happy? What's the sort of magic cultural ingredients, the magical cultural sauce? And what we found continually is that actually the extreme levels of both tight and loose are really maladaptive. So extremely loose cultures, whether they're nations or organizations, they have very few rules and very few coordination mechanisms, tend to have a lot of suicide and low happiness and low GDP. But also extremely repressive on the flip side, countries also and organizations have a lot of problems. And part of that Goldilocks principle just means all in moderation, is that the idea is that groups need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, like we talked about, but we need to be mindful of when they're getting too extreme. And that applies also, by the way, to even parenting. Like we know that either super laissez-faire parents or helicopter-like produce maladaptive kids. And so it's something that I think is really important to try to balance and calibrate, whether it's organizations or nations. Because when you get too loose, as I mentioned, it invites a lot of tight forces.
But you mentioned suicide, and that's something to go back to the United States. Like we are watching really an unprecedented rise in young people, anxiety, suicides.
All, of course, seemingly correlated to the arrival of the internet, and
there's big correlation. But you could also argue, and whether it's caused by the internet, and this has sort of helped me understand this, is this and maybe the internet has made it a more chaotic society, a society with fewer norms, and
disinhibited, right?
And then also this lack of, you wrote about dating apps, which was really interesting, this idea there's this, like, too much choice is bad, too much freedom is bad in that sense. And maybe these young people just feel the world is your oyster, but the world is your oyster. Like there's too much.
I think you just hit the nail on the head. And in fact, just this morning, I was listening to my undergraduates present some new data where we looked at it's not the amount of time you spend online that it relates to loneliness and depression, because we measure this. It's the amount of time you spend and the amount of normlessness you perceive on the internet. This kind of wild west. Normlessness. It's this extreme looseness. Anything goes. It's the Wild West. Right. So we measured these things, and we can see that it's really the people that are online a lot, but that are experiencing this sense that this place is just the Wild West. And psychologists have known for decades that when you're not in a place that you feel monitored, it makes you become really disinhibited and really like anything goes. Right. And so the internet, it was developed really quickly. It has all these great characteristics of connectivity, but it's normless. Right. I mean, there's some bottom-up organizing like on Reddit or some top-down questions.
Right. People are trying to form communities, but it has been, I think it's just been so disruptive overall.
There's also, interestingly, maybe this speaks to your point about getting a kind of very strong reaction to things, that there is this call-out culture on the internet now, right? The call-out and canceling culture, that it's like an extreme response to the chaos of the multiplicity of voices is, fine, no, actually you are totally silenced, you are unpersoned. Yeah.
I think that, we're in this transition phase. Like we've been in many parts of our human history where we learn to operate as very small groups and then suddenly interact with, hundreds of strangers. And we figured out, we calibrated, we developed norms to deal with these new circumstances. And the internet's sort of the next phase of, it will take us some time, but the hope is that we'll develop some kind of Goldilocks balance on the internet where we have freedom, but we have also we'll develop that Goldilocks balance on the internet where we have freedom, but we have some degree of constraint where it's something that we can feel like this is a world we want to live in. And we're trying to calibrate that now. And I'm optimistic as a psychologist and someone who thinks about
I'm glad to hear it.
that we will get there.
I'm really
it will take some time.
So in fact, we'll be the generation that remembers when people were shot in the saloon, and people will be like, "Why the West is so civilized."
Exactly. Okay, before you go, Megan.
Yes.
I have copied down Michelle's test of.
This is an ambush.
It is an ambush.
Okay. Loose mindset.
I think I know where.
You will analyze her answers, okay?
This is
So here,
okay. I'm
only
human.
three, it's only
a
three
chaos
questions.
Muppet or an order Muppet?
Yeah, I love it. You did the Muppets. That was so good. Okay, 3 questions. And those of you at home can write these down. How much do you notice the norms around you and the expectations that people have of you?
Oh, I notice them a lot. I score high on tightness in that regard.
Do you tend to be cautious and controlled or adventurous and impulsive?
Baby, it just depends on how much I've had to drink. No, gee whiz, I have to say I come down 50-50 on that.
You can be on a spectrum, right?
Can I be I'm on the spectrum on that one.
Are you a creature of habit, preferring structure and social order? Or do you enjoy situations that are less structured?
I am a creature of structure and order.
So you probably, I would guess, put another Cosmo on this, that you're probably moderately tight.
I would say so.
And again, we can shift depending on the situation. These are things that are dynamic, but that we each have our own, based on our own culture and our upbringing and our degrees of threat and mobility and all sorts of things.
Right. But you essentially like rules, and when they're not there,
yeah, I don't like it.
them.
Yeah, that's
You
exactly
create
right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think I'm on the spectrum. I realize I've taken up gardening like every middle-aged woman.
I know, isn't it funny? You think you're original, like, I have had this idea. No, actually, you're
I'm just
at
taking
exactly
up
the point
gardening.
in life.
And I realized the type of garden I like most is the English garden. And the English garden is distinctive because it has imagine boxwood hedges, of perimeters, and then inside is
Explosion.
chaos.
Yeah.
There's explosions of flowers.
Beauty
And I realize I want, I will, if I go to a cafe, if I'm like a regular at a cafe, I will want to sit at the same table, in the same chair.
with a new drink.
Nope. I want the same thing every day. And in that way, I'm just a total creature of habit. But I also want
You like the contained chaos. You like the kind of
but then
generative power.
yeah,
of the
let's just
fun.
open that bottle of wine and go wild. Like there's that too, right?
And that's interesting because that shows it's also domain specific for individuals. Like you might
Right.
veer towards one direction, but then find some ways to be kind of crazy loose. So you might veer loose, but then find some ways to be tighter. And that's, it's nice to think about
But I
how we
love
strike
that.
the balance.
Right. I love the outer order. The world is going as it should be. It's not chaos. And then you have your own, we should just loosen up and go dancing, that kind of thing.
No, I think this is such an important book. I really hope that everybody gets this book, and I hope that everybody reads this book. Rule makers, rule breakers.
Rule breakers, how tight and loose cultures wire our world.
It's so because it actually really encourages a very generous understanding of other people.
Right.
I 1,000 examples have sprung to mind just in things with my relationships with my friends or with my parents, with my husband, with my children, with the different ways that my children behave. It kind of explains so much about the world. It is, in fact, the key to all mythology.
And I appreciate on my website there's a tight loose mindset quiz. It's just michellegelfand.com.
Okay.
And also a place where people
can we take
stories.
it? Can we take it and then
it will give you your score.
Oh, so I love those. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a place where also the most important thing for me in this website is a place where you can send me stories about how this affects your life.
Okay, let me spell
that. That's why I wrote this, to get out there and have your audience, and it's michellegelfand.com.
Okay, no, but it's
it's one L.
Michele Gelfand, G as in George, ELFAND as in David.com.
Yeah, and you can read about the research on the website. I mean, the book is really based on a lot of science, but it's accessible, I hope. But it's also a place where I want to hear from your listeners. How does this resonate with your life? What stories do you have? I've had so many people write in with amazing stories about their marriages, about their workplace, about how they have a new self-understanding. And that to me is the whole reason for writing this.
I hope you're an advisor to the world. I hope.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking that too.
I think can you just be an
advisor to the world?
Could you just go solve the Israeli-Arab peace process? Can we just send you over to this corporate merger?
Can
you come to my house and resolve this
I'm ready.
argument
I'm
with
available.
my husband?
No problem.
I have a teenage daughter, and her room is a little too loose.
I got 2 of those, so I can really.
Well, let's end it on a quote from you. You said, by viewing the culture of, you said each social class, but let's say everyone, through a tight, loose lens, we can develop greater respect for people across class lines and prevent harmful misunderstandings.
That's what I hope.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Amen.
So, all right. Cheers.
Thank
Drink
you.
that Cosmo, girl.
Drink up. Thank you, ladies.
right.
It was fabulous to connect
Oh, wonderful to have
with
you.
your great podcast. I'm a big fan.
Rule makers, rule breakers. Michele Gelfand, 1L and Michelle.
Woo.
Cheers.
Okay, that was fantastic. What a fascinating person.
And also, what a fun person. Like,
yeah,
she just rolled in here
full
as
of
like
life.
Cosmo.
No, she's
amazing.
Terrific. And her book really is genuinely a wonderful book. And
Yep.
there are so many things. I mean, I have a million questions that I, of course, didn't want to interrupt her because she
Right.
was so like bubbly and full of
Right.
life. But when she was talking about how she's optimistic about, our adaptation to the internet.
That was a relief.
Fascinating.
Honest to God.
Completely. And I also wondered if part of what is dividing us as a country, what's happening in other Western countries that is causing all this, disruption and misery and kind of mutual hostility and contempt, if that isn't actually itself a response to the arrival of the internet, and that maybe,
Right.
we can kind of come out of this.
No, I think it's a real Pandora's box that we're dealing with. There's huge senses of displacement, and then they manifest themselves in like these stories about immigration. She talked about, that the demagogue will play on fears and
The authoritarian. Yeah.
the authoritarian or the demagogue, and people will turn to that if they aren't being given reassurance. So, I mean, there are many, many lessons for the political times that we live in, but I just liked her on the personal. It was actually, we're always being taught to show empathy from an almost religious perspective or an etiquette, but I like this just idea, like, just understand this person is tight.
People are different.
Different.
Right.
You are going to get upset when your husband throws wet towels on the bed. So how are you going to resolve that? It's a small
That
issue.
is actually a sign of psychopathy, I'm just going to say.
This is divorce. No, but it's one of those things like, okay, somebody does something that bugs you.
Right.
So deconstruct it.
Right.
How are they different from you? How do you ask them or, quote, train them not to
But also,
that,
it invites you to see yourself on that same
Right.
spectrum,
And
to
maybe
realize,
I'm-
so maybe I'm a little
overreact.
pissy about this, and I should be, or I could be more relaxed. Or
Not about the towels on the bed.
no, obviously that is very sick. But to other people, we may seem, and I mean, really, if you think about it in life, you think there are all kinds of ways in which this manifests. The friend who really needs to be in touch all the time on email, and if you're not in touch, feels neglected.
Right.
Well, that
Or by
friend,
phone.
Oh, God help us. But that friend has a different setting, right? Maybe I don't know where it fits in the tight and loose, but so they're tighter, you're looser, so it's something you can accept,
Well, once you realize that, and then you deal with that person.
We're like going to rise to a higher plane, thanks to Michele Gelfand.
I know, and her Riesling. No, it's like, look, my mother is much more.
She's tightened up.
She's
in her later
really
years.
tightened up. And I've learned, instead of getting annoyed, like when we travel together and it's amazing, but she needs to know exactly what we're going to do that day.
Right.
And it used to bug me.
Right.
And I would say, I don't know, let's just like freewheel it. And like that would drive her crazy. And then that would drive me crazy. Anyway, and now I just know, like, file the flight plan, beginning of the day. We all know what we're doing. Is that such a big ask? No.
Right.
And you get everything goes way more smoothly.
Well, and again, it bespeaks that sort of more generous view of the world and the more generous view of other people, more respectful.
And it's not just about me, and it's not just about the way I like to do things.
Right, exactly, which is a miserable way to live because nobody else is following the same script that you're following. And if you expect them to follow the same script, you're constantly finding fault with everybody around you. And where is the fun in that?
Yeah. Exactly. Well said, Megs.
Thanks.
So we went long, but we did get a wonderful listener reaction to some advice that Christina and I'd given. I don't know why people write to us for advice, but anyway, we had a great listener reaction, and Jane is going to read it, and it's a little bit of a story, so we're not cutting it because it's such a good story. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. This is from Lily, and she is a big Femsplainers fan. This is a response to your listener who wrote in last time about how to let a close friend know he'd like to be more than friends. You suggested he take her out on a nice date and in a manly way ask if she likes him back or something like that. You mentioned he could try to woo her. Interesting, in the animal kingdom, males generally show off or put themselves on display to convince the females that they are a desirable mate. What if your listener wooed his friend by showing her that his presence in her life can make the world a better, sweeter place for her?
Oh, that's lovely.
It's really sweet. I wanted to share with him how my sweetie did this. In early summer 2016, I had recently broken off a very unhealthy relationship, and I was feeling like I just needed my family around me and no dating, no meeting new men, nothing. So then, through my brother, I met Neil. And we really hit it off the first time we met, but not enough for me to change my mind. He asked if he could see me again, and I told him I didn't have time to hang out, but he could help me and my dad pull up some carpet here at my grandma's house if he wanted. I said that as a joke, but what kind of guy wants to do voluntary hard labor for a girl he just met? That summer, my dad happened to have a lot of such projects. Wow, this guy's going to be a knight in shining armor. Neil came over every chance he got and always brought little gifts or tokens, watermelons, fruits, and veggies from the garden. He became a dependable and dear friend to me and to my siblings. I know this is corny, but when he finally really, truly good and kissed me, I felt like I had found what I hadn't known I was looking for. I felt like I was home.
Oh, that is such a lovely story.
That's so sweet.
Oh, see, that is the opposite of what we were describing at the very beginning. This kind of rigid, brittle approach to male-female relations. It's that also.
Or does he tick boxes on my dating profile?
Oh God, who did he vote for? No, is he lovely? Right, that's the question.
Well, could he? I guess. I mean, Jane, who is 25.
Yes,
and married,
yes.
Good girl, clever girl.
No, I'm kidding.
But could that could go modern day? That could go the wrong way. Like, oh my God, he's
like a stalker.
He's like, why is he doing this? And it could put him permanently in the friend zone. But he was more like some sort of Jane Austen character, or something,
showing how honorable and dependable he was.
But without, maybe he didn't push it too much. He just showed up. He just pulled the carpet. He just. Hey, brought some vegetables from my garden. Not creepy, not stalkery. Mm-hmm. Joked with the younger sibling. That's
very impressive and very lovely, and I hope they have a long and happy life together.
Well, they seem to have been, because I think she ended it by saying, and it still feels that way today.
Lovely.
Something like that. All right, well, that's a beautiful way to end the show.
Indeed.
And Meg, thank you for co-splaining.
It was a joy to co-splain with you.
It's always a joy to have you. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
And have a great week.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Hey, thanks for listening to the Femsplainers. Stay with us by following us on Twitter and Facebook at Femsplainers and on Instagram at Femsplainers Podcast. You can always email questions and comments to contact@femsplainers.com. We read every one.
We are recorded at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and thanks to AEI Research Assistant Zoe Appler, who is our production assistant here in the studio, and thanks to Nat Frum, our audio and video editor, and occasional millennial mansplainer.
And listen to us on pretty much any of your favorite podcast platforms. And please remember to subscribe and like us at iTunes if possible. Every like helps us keep our solid 5-star rating. Cheers.